The bitter conflict between Israel and the Palestinian militant group Hamas has its roots in the early 20th century Zionist movement and the subsequent struggle surrounding the creation of the State of Israel. This decades-long clash has evolved through various phases, with tensions periodically escalating into full-blown wars that have taken a devastating human toll. This documentary will delve into the complex history and key events underlying the Israel-Hamas confrontation over the past century. Origins of Zionism. The origins of the Israel-Hamas conflict can be traced back to the late 19th century rise of Zionism among European Jews. Zionism was a nationalist movement that advocated for establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. Zionism emerged in the context of rising anti-Semitism across Europe, including pogroms targeting Jews in the Russian Empire. Key early Zionist thinkers and activists included Theodor Herzl, considered the father of modern political Zionism. In 1896, Herzl published The Jewish State, which argued that the only way for Jews to live free from discrimination was to establish their own independent state. Mainstream Zionists aimed to pursue their goals peacefully through mass migration to Palestine and obtaining consent from local Arab inhabitants. However, more radical factions also developed, willing to use force if necessary. Other divisions existed between secular and religious Zionists. In the 1880s, an organized migration of Jews fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe and Russia settled in Palestine, which was then home to small, long-established Jewish communities as well as a majority Arab population. Early Jewish immigrants purchased lands from absentee Arab landlords and founded new agricultural settlements like Petah Tikva, Rishon LeZion, and Rosh Pinna. Zionist groups like Hovivi Zion and the World Zionist Organization helped fund and coordinate this growing Jewish immigration to Palestine, known as the First Aliyah. By 1900, around 30,000 Jews lived in Palestine, though only constituting 5% of the population. The Arab inhabitants of Palestine initially did not mount significant resistance to early Zionism and Jewish immigration. However, tensions gradually rose as the influx of Jewish settlers increased through the early 20th century. The emergence of Arab nationalism. At the same time as Zionism was emerging, an Arab national awakening developed among Palestinian intellectuals and Christians. The growth of Arab nationalism was spurred by opposition to the Ottoman Empire as well as the threat posed by growing Jewish immigration. Figures such as Jerusalem's Grand Mufti Hajj Amin al-Husseini positioned themselves as leaders of the Palestinian Arab cause and were hostile to Zionism. Arab peasants also resented Zionist land purchases that disrupted traditional village life and social structures. As Jewish immigration accelerated in the 1920s and 1930s, the Arab population revolted in efforts to curb Jewish presence in Palestine, which they saw as their own homeland. This set the stage for escalating confrontations between Zionist ambitions and Arab nationalism in Palestine under British control. The British Mandate period. After World War I and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, Britain took control of Palestine. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, which expressed favor for establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine. This alarmed the local Arab population there. During its mandate rule throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Britain struggled to reconcile these contradictory promises and commitments to Jews and Arabs in Palestine. Jewish immigration increased substantially during this period, especially after the rise of Nazism and anti-Jewish policies in Germany and Eastern Europe starting in the 1930s. From 1922 to 1948, the Jewish population in Palestine surged from around 84,000 to over 600,000, fueled by refugees fleeing persecution. Local Palestinian Arabs protested and revolted violently against both British rule and this flood of Jewish immigrants. Radical underground militant groups also emerged among the Jews in Palestine, such as the Irgun and Lehi. These groups were willing to use force against local Arabs as well as the British authorities to advance the Zionist cause. The British tried to appease the Arabs by restricting Jewish land purchases and imposing strict limits on Jewish immigration, even as European Jews desperately sought refuge from the Holocaust. After World War II, conflict intensified between Jewish militias like Haganah and the occupying British forces. With the situation spiraling out of control, Britain decided in 1947 to withdraw from Palestine and turn the issue over to the newly established United Nations. Britain's decisions and changing policies during its Mandate rule laid the groundwork for later confrontations. The UN Partition Plan to the 1948 war. In 1947, the United Nations approved a partition plan to divide Palestine into independent Jewish and Arab states after the British withdrawal. The plan allocated over half the land to the proposed Jewish state, even though Jews made up less than a third of the population and owned just 7% of the land. Jewish leaders accepted the UN plan as a means to create their long-sought independent state. However, Palestinian Arabs and leaders of nearby Arab nations rejected the UN plan and viewed it as unfairly favoring the Zionist ambitions with little regard for local Arab rights and claims to Palestine. Soon after the partition plan was approved, fighting broke out between Jewish paramilitary groups like Haganah and Irgun and Arab forces. Escalating violence between the two sides eventually erupted into full-scale civil war by 1948, when the British Mandate officially expired. On May 14, 1948, Israel declared its independence as the Jewish state of Israel, prompting a military intervention the next day by 5 surrounding Arab countries, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. This wider regional Arab-Israeli war lasted until 1949. During this war, over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were forcibly expelled from their homes, becoming refugees. Israeli political and military leaders opposed allowing Palestinian refugees to return after the war, despite UN resolutions calling for refugees to be allowed back or compensated. The 1949 armistice agreements established permanent borders between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The West Bank and East Jerusalem came under Jordanian control, while Egypt occupied Gaza. This first Arab-Israeli war and the resulting Palestinian displacement became known among Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe. The scattered Palestinian refugees viewed the West Bank and Gaza as rightfully their lands and demanded their own sovereign Palestinian state. However, Israel refused to surrender the additional territory it had captured and occupied during the war. This refusal created grievances that underpinned later tensions and confrontations. The Second Intifada. Over 50 years after Israel's establishment, tensions boiled over into the Second Intifada uprising that lasted from 2000 to 2005. This erupted after the collapse of the Camp David summit mediated by U.S. President Bill Clinton in 2000. The summit aimed to produce a final status peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, but stalled over disputes related to borders, Jerusalem, Jewish settlements, and Palestinian refugees' right of return. The failure to make progress after years of negotiation added to Palestinian frustration. On September 28, 2000, the Second Intifada was ignited when Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon made a provocative visit to the Temple Mount complex in Jerusalem, accompanied by over 1,000 security forces. This enraged Palestinians, who responded with mass protests. What began as persistent civil disobedience and rock-throwing escalated into a full-blown armed uprising by Palestinians across Gaza and the West Bank, with waves of suicide bombings and shootings targeting Israeli civilians. Israel undertook harsh military reprisals and reoccupied many Palestinian urban areas. The Second Intifada came to an end by 2005 after Yasser Arafat's death and a change in Palestinian leadership. Over 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians died over the 5 years of conflict, making it the deadliest period of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The violence decreased momentum for a negotiated peace settlement and increased disillusionment on both sides. Additional factors during the Second Intifada included Israel beginning construction of a separation barrier through Palestinian territory, isolating PLO leader Yasser Arafat, and growing Iranian support for Palestinian militant groups like Hamas. This overview covers the deep historical roots and early formative events underlying the emergence of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Israel's Gaza withdrawal and Hamas takeover. A major turning point occurred in 2005 when Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon unilaterally withdrew all military forces in Jewish settlements from the Gaza Strip without a peace deal with Palestinians. Sharon justified the disengagement plan as reducing friction with Palestinians in Gaza. However, Israel retained control over Gaza's borders, coastline, airspace, electromagnetic sphere, and population registry. Critics argued this continued Gaza's occupation. After Israel's withdrawal, the Palestinian Authority held elections in 2006. The Islamist group Hamas won a majority, alarming Israel and Western powers who consider Hamas a terrorist organization due to its refusal to renounce violence and recognize Israel. Clashes erupted between Hamas and the rival Fatah party. In 2007, Hamas forcibly took over Gaza, ousting Fatah officials and prompting Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to dismiss the Hamas government. This split the Palestinian territories politically between Hamas-run Gaza and the Fatah-led West Bank. Israel responded by imposing an economic blockade on Gaza, restricting the movement of people and goods across borders and at sea. Egypt also largely sealed its border crossing with Gaza at Rafah. Israel tightened its blockade after Hamas diverted imported concrete and other materials for military purposes like tunnel building. Hamas proceeded to launch frequent rocket attacks from Gaza against southern Israeli cities and towns. Israel countered militarily with airstrikes, artillery fire, and temporary ground incursions into Gaza, aimed at stopping the rocket fire and destroying Hamas tunnels. This set the stage for a series of full-blown armed confrontations between Israel and Hamas lasting from 2008 to 2014, costing thousands of lives due to Israeli military offensives aimed at halting Hamas rocket attacks and weakening the organization's capabilities. Peak periods of Hamas-Israel clashes. The worst fighting occurred from December 2008 to January 2009, with Israel launching Operation Cast Lead after the breakdown of a 6-month ceasefire and continued Hamas rocket attacks. The 3-week offensive involved waves of airstrikes followed by a ground invasion of Gaza by Israeli troops and tanks. Estimates of the death toll range from 1,166 to 1,417 Palestinians killed and 13 Israeli deaths. On November 14, 2012, Israel assassinated Hamas commander Ahmed Jabari, triggering an 8-day conflict known as Operation Pillar of Defense by Israel and the Gaza War by Palestinians. Israel made heavy use of airstrikes while Hamas intensified rocket attacks on Israel's urban centers. Around 167 Palestinians and 6 Israelis died. The heaviest and most devastating clashes took place in July-August 2014, in the aftermath of the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers by Hamas militants in the West Bank. Both sides rebuffed ceasefire efforts by Egypt and others. Israel responded with Operation Protective Edge, an extended military offensive that started with airstrikes followed by a ground invasion. During 50 days of fighting, around 2,100 Palestinians and 66 Israeli soldiers and civilians died. The UN warned Gaza could become uninhabitable if violence persisted. Current status of the conflict. Despite recurring ceasefire agreements, tensions frequently flare up between the Israeli military and Gaza militant groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who aim rockets at Israeli population centers near Gaza. Both sides blame each other for violating and collapsing ceasefires. Major issues perpetuating the conflict include Israel's economic blockade and movement restrictions on Gaza, continuing Israeli settlement construction in the West Bank, lack of progress on peace talks, Palestinian political divisions, and competition between militant factions on both sides to appear tough. As of late 2022, there is no substantive peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. Comprehensive negotiations have stalled since the 1990s and early 2000s. The absence of concerted diplomacy, or terms of reference to facilitate talks, allows recurring violence to spiral. Periodic armed confrontations, combined with Gaza's economic struggles under Israeli blockade and Hamas rule, have taken a serious humanitarian toll. The Israel-Hamas conflict remains deadlocked and continues to flare up dangerously without a political horizon in sight. Ways the conflict could have been solved. While the Israel-Hamas confrontation seems highly intractable currently, many analysts point to steps that could pave the way for eventual progress. These include rebuilding trust through gradual cooperative initiatives on issues like economic development or environmental protection. Creating incentives for positive steps on both sides is key. Engaging with and strengthening Palestinian moderates can also help marginalize extremists over time. Additionally, conflict resolution experts emphasize addressing root causes like restrictions on Gaza and settlement growth to deny militants their recruiting tools. Creative diplomacy and people-to-people outreach to humanize both sides for each other's publics remains important, despite setbacks. Of course, achieving real change requires courageous leadership on all sides, ready to take risks for peace against anti-compromise factions. With time, patience, and perseverance, the dynamics sustaining this conflict could shift toward reconciliation. But easy solutions are unlikely given the long, complex history. In conclusion, this examination of the Israel-Hamas conflict highlights how competing nationalist movements and claims to the same territory can fuel generations of confrontation, violence, and human suffering. What began as an ideological dispute transformed into an entrenched, existential conflict seen as zero-sum by both sides. Divergent narratives and memories of the past have created mutual fear and hostility. Attempts to address Palestinian disaffection through the peace process failed to resolve final status issues like refugees, borders, settlements, and division of Jerusalem. This perpetuates a cycle of action and reaction. The absence of political solutions allows extremism to thrive, empowering radicals like Hamas who exploit desperation. Meanwhile, ordinary people on both sides pay the price amid the cycle of blockade, rockets, and bombardment. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and leave a comment on your thoughts and feelings about the whole Middle East situation, and what you would do if you had the chance to fix it. What would you do? Until next time, don't forget, keep exploring.